20,000. That's how many Jewish refugees, men, women, children, entire families stripped of citizenship, property, and future, found themselves living in a single square mile of bombed-out Shanghai between 1938 and 1945. And the most disturbing part of that number is not its size, it's the comparison. According to the Simon Wiesenthal Center, Shanghai, a city most European Jews had never heard of, a port on the other side of the planet under Japanese military occupation, accepted more Jewish refugees during World War II than Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India combined. This is the story of how one of the strangest paradoxes in modern history saved 20,000 lives. It involves a fabricated anti-Semitic document that accidentally became a rescue plan, a Chinese diplomat who defied his own government to sign visas for people he'd never met, a Gestapo colonel known as the Butcher of Warsaw who traveled to Asia with explicit orders to implement the final solution on Chinese soil, and a Japanese military that refused. Not because they loved Jews, but because they believed the lies written about them. To understand how Shanghai became the last open door on Earth, you need to understand what was closing everywhere else. In July 1938, delegates from 32 countries gathered at the luxurious Hôtel Royal in Évian-les-Bains, France. The purpose of the conference was to discuss what to do about the hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. For 9 days, country after country took the podium and said, in polished diplomatic language, the same thing: not us. Australia's delegate, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Walter White, said his country had no racial problem and did not wish to import one. Canada was similarly blunt. The United States, which had organized the conference, refused to raise its own immigration quotas. The Dominican Republic was the only nation willing to accept refugees in significant numbers, up to 100,000, though far fewer actually arrived. The message to Europe's Jews was devastating in its clarity. There was nowhere to go. But there was one place that didn't require a visa, a passport, a sponsor, an affidavit, or a single piece of paper: Shanghai. The reason was not generosity, it was chaos. By 1937, Japan had invaded China and occupied large sections of Shanghai, including the district known as Hongqiu. But the city's international settlement, a patchwork of foreign concessions governed by multiple colonial powers, still operated under pre-war rules. No passport control existed at the port. Anyone with a boat ticket could disembark. And in 1938, after the Kristallnacht pogrom of November 9th and 10th, when the Nazis burned over 200 synagogues, looted 7,500 Jewish shops, and sent 30,000 Jewish men to concentration camps, the desperation to leave became absolute. Thousands of Jews who couldn't get into any country discovered that they could get into Shanghai simply by buying a ticket on an Italian steamship from the port of Genoa. Lloyd Triestino, the Italian shipping line, ran what amounted to a ferry service. The ships were luxurious, 3-week Mediterranean cruises with uniformed stewards serving breakfast. The passengers, many of whom had just been released from concentration camps on the condition that they prove emigration, described the journey as surreal. 1 week they were being beaten in Dachau. 3 weeks later they were eating dinner on white tablecloths as the coast of Egypt passed by the porthole. And then they arrived in Shanghai, stepped off the gangplank, and found themselves standing in a soup kitchen line in one of the most impoverished neighborhoods in Asia. Hongqiu had been devastated by the Sino-Japanese War. Entire blocks were rubble. The infrastructure was shattered. And into this district, between November 1938 and September 1939, approximately 17,000 German and Austrian Jews arrived with almost nothing. Nazi law required them to pay an escalating emigration tax and restricted how much money could leave German banks. Most arrived with 10 Reichsmarks, about $4. They carried a suitcase, perhaps a few pieces of furniture, and the clothes they were wearing. What they found was a place that already had a Jewish history. Two communities predated the refugees. The older was a small, wealthy group of about 700 Sephardic Jews, Iraqi traders whose families had arrived in the mid-1800s and built commercial empires. The Sassoons, the Kaduris, the Hardoons. These were among the richest families in Shanghai. The second community comprised several thousand Ashkenazi Jews who had fled Russia during the 1917 revolution, mostly modest shopkeepers and small business owners. These existing communities, along with the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, scrambled to absorb the flood. Victor Sassoon and Paul Comore established the International Committee for European Immigrants. Horace Kaduri funded schools. The Kaduri School would educate hundreds of refugee children. They prepared housing in Hongqiu because it was the cheapest district, but housing is a generous word for what was available. Former schools converted into barracks, shabby apartments off narrow alleyways, rooms shared by 10 people with 2 small beds per family. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Every morning, buckets of night soil were emptied and carted away by Chinese workers. Malnutrition was common. Disease, typhus, dysentery, was constant. And yet, something extraordinary happened inside that square mile. The refugees, stripped of everything, rebuilt, not metaphorically, literally. Architects and builders among them transformed bombed-out sections of Hongqiu. By 1940, a stretch of Chusan Road had earned the nickname Little Vienna. There were Viennese-style cafes serving real Sachertorte. The Eisfelder family, who had arrived at the end of 1938, opened Café Louis, which became one of the most popular gathering places for refugees throughout the war. There were delicatessens, nightclubs, bakeries, shops selling European goods. Small factories sprang up. Doctors set up practices. Teachers opened schools. Over 10 German-language newspapers and magazines were printed and circulated. Theater groups performed. An orchestra played classical concerts. Sports teams, soccer, table tennis, boxing, competed in leagues. A man named Ernest Heppner, whose family had owned a matzah factory in Germany, arrived in February 1939 with his mother, 3 months after Kristallnacht. His father and sister stayed behind. They perished. Ernest and his mother found work. He would later meet his wife in Shanghai, marry her there, and emigrate to the United States in 1947. This wasn't resilience as a slogan. This was 20,000 people constructing a functioning European society inside an Asian slum while the world that expelled them burned. But there's a layer beneath this story that most people have never heard, and it starts with a book that shouldn't exist. In 1903, agents of the Russian secret police fabricated a document called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It purported to be the minutes of a secret meeting in which Jewish leaders outlined a plan for world domination, controlling economies, governments, media, everything. The document was a complete forgery, plagiarized largely from a French political satire that had nothing to do with Jews. But it spread. It was translated into every major language. Henry Ford distributed 500,000 copies in the United States. The Nazis used it as core propaganda. It became the most widely circulated anti-Semitic text in history, responsible for incalculable suffering. And in Japan, it did something no one could have predicted. In 1919, Japanese military officers fought alongside the anti-Semitic White Russian army against the Bolsheviks. The White Russians introduced the Japanese to the protocols. The officers read it, and instead of developing hatred for Jews, they developed admiration. The logic was perverse but internally consistent. If Jews really controlled the world's banks, governments, and media, then Jews were exactly the kind of ally Japan needed. If you believe someone is secretly powerful, you don't persecute them. You court them. This thinking crystallized in 1934 when Captain Koreshige Inuzuka and Colonel Norihiro Yasue, two of Japan's self-appointed Jewish experts, began developing what would become known as the Fugu Plan. The name came from the Japanese word for pufferfish, a delicacy that can kill you if prepared incorrectly, but is exquisite when handled with care. The metaphor was explicit. Jews were potentially dangerous, but immensely valuable if managed correctly. Inuzuka and Yasue proposed settling large numbers of Jewish refugees in Japanese-controlled territory, Manchuria, Shanghai, to gain what they believed would be enormous economic benefits, and, crucially, to win favor with what they imagined was the all-powerful American Jewish lobby, which they assumed controlled United States foreign policy. The plan reached the highest levels of government. On December 6, 1938, 5 of Japan's most powerful ministers, Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe, Foreign Minister Hachiro Arita, Army Minister Seishiro Itagaki, Naval Minister Mitsumasa Yonai, and Finance Minister Shigeaki Ikeda, met for what became known as the Five Ministers' Conference. They made a decision. Jews in Japan, Manchuria, and China would not be expelled and would be treated the same as other foreigners. The alliance with Nazi Germany was important, but so was the imagined Jewish global network. As an immediate result, 14,000 to 15,000 Eastern European Jews were granted asylum in the Japanese quarter of Shanghai. The European quarters, by contrast, admitted almost none. Let that sink in. A fabricated document designed to justify the persecution and murder of Jews was read by Japanese military planners and interpreted as evidence that Jews should be protected. The most infamous anti-Semitic hoax in history accidentally saved lives, not through truth, but through a misreading of a lie. Meanwhile, 7,000 kilometers away, in Vienna, a quiet Chinese diplomat was performing his own act of rescue, and no one would know about it for over 50 years. Feng Shanho was born in 1901 in rural Yiyang, Hunan province. His father died when he was 7. He studied at the Yali School in Changsha, earned a doctorate in political economy from Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, and entered the Chinese diplomatic service. In 1938, when Germany annexed Austria, the Chinese legation in Vienna was downgraded to a consulate, and Ho became consul general. He watched what happened to Vienna's Jews. The Anschluss unleashed immediate, organized violence. Jewish property was confiscated, bank accounts frozen. Jews were beaten in the streets, forced to scrub sidewalks on their knees, while crowds laughed. Adolf Eichmann established his Office of Jewish Emigration in Vienna in August 1938, designed to accelerate forced departure. But departure required proof of a destination, a visa, any visa, and every consulate in Vienna was besieged by desperate families, and almost everyone turned them away. Ho started signing visas to Shanghai. He knew Shanghai didn't technically require a visa for entry. That wasn't the point. The visa wasn't for entering Shanghai. It was for leaving Austria. The Nazis would release Jews, even from concentration camps, if they could show documentation proving they had somewhere to go. The piece of paper with Ho's signature and the Chinese consular seal was a key that opened the door out of the Reich. He issued the 200th visa in June 1938. By October 27, 1938, the serial number on his visas had reached 1906. He was averaging 400 to 500 visas per month. At times, the monthly count reached 900. 17-year-old Erich Goldstaub came to the Chinese consulate after being rejected by 50 other consulates. Ho issued 20 visas for his entire extended family. Hedy Durlister's father was arrested after the Anschluss. Her mother obtained a Chinese visa from Ho and presented it to the Nazi authorities as proof of emigration. Her father was released. Ho's superior, Chen Jie, the Chinese ambassador in Berlin, was furious. Chen Jie wanted good relations with Germany and considered the visa operation insubordinate. He telephoned Ho and ordered him to stop. Ho replied that the Foreign Ministry's instructions were to maintain a liberal policy. Chen Jie sent an inspector to Vienna to investigate rumors that Ho was selling visas for personal profit. The inspector arrived unannounced, found no evidence of corruption, returned to Berlin, and placed a negative mark in Ho's personnel file. Ho continued signing. When the Nazis confiscated the consulate building on the grounds that it was Jewish-owned property, and the Chinese government refused to fund relocation, Ho found smaller facilities and paid for them out of his own pocket. On at least one occasion, according to testimony recorded by Yad Vashem, Ho personally faced down an armed Gestapo officer to protect a Jewish family. He later wrote, "Since the annexation of Austria by Germany, the persecution of the Jews by Hitler's devils became increasingly fierce. I spared no effort in using any means possible. Innumerable Jews were thus saved." He never spoke publicly about what he did. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to friends. He died in San Francisco in 1997 at the age of 96. Only after his death did survivors begin contacting Yad Vashem with evidence. In 2000, Ho was posthumously recognized as righteous among the nations. His daughter, Manly Ho, has spent decades since piecing together the scope of her father's actions. The exact number of visas he issued remains unknown, but conservative estimates place it at several thousand. The number of lives those visas represent, counting family members who escaped on a single document, may reach into the tens of thousands. Back in Shanghai, life inside the designated area tightened after Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and immediately seized all of Shanghai, including the international settlement. The flow of American funds, the lifeline of the refugee community, stopped overnight. Wealthy Sephardic Jews with British passports were interned as enemy nationals. Bank accounts were frozen. Several newspapers ceased publication. And then came the pressure from Berlin. In 1942, Gestapo Obersturmbannführer Josef Meisinger arrived in Shanghai. Meisinger was not a bureaucrat. He was known as the Butcher of Warsaw for his role in the mass executions of Polish civilians and Jews in 1939 and 1940. He had been assigned as the Gestapo's liaison with the German embassy in Tokyo and the Japanese military police, the Kenpei Tai. His mission in Shanghai was specific: convince the Japanese to implement the final solution in Asia. His proposals were concrete. He suggested creating a concentration camp on Chongming Island in the Yangtze River Delta. Alternatively, he proposed loading Jews onto freighters, sailing them out to sea, and starving them to death. He also discussed forced labor in salt mines. The Japanese admiral who governed Shanghai refused. The Fugu Plan was effectively dead by 1942. Japan had officially rescinded the Five Ministers' Conference decision that year, removing even theoretical support for Jewish settlement. But the underlying logic persisted. Massacring 20,000 Jews when you believed that the Jews controlled American finance and media seemed strategically suicidal. The Japanese didn't protect Jews out of compassion. They protected them out of a miscalculation rooted in a forgery. But the result was the same. Meisinger's plans were reduced to the creation of a ghetto, not an extermination camp. On February 18, 1943, the Japanese issued the proclamation concerning restriction of residence and business of stateless refugees. All Jews who had arrived in Shanghai after 1937 were ordered to relocate to the designated area in Hongqiu within 3 months. The area was approximately 1 square mile, 2.5 square kilometers. Many refugees already lived there. Those who didn't had to move, abandoning whatever businesses or apartments they had established elsewhere. Life inside the designated area was controlled by the Bureau of Stateless Refugee Affairs, headed by former naval officer Tsutomu Kubota. But the faces the refugees saw daily belonged to two subordinates who became figures of terror and humiliation: Ghoya and Okura. Ghoya, a diminutive man who called himself the King of the Jews, controlled the passes that refugees needed to leave the ghetto for work. He was erratic, sometimes jovial, sometimes violent. He would approve a pass with a smile one day and slap a refugee across the face the next. Requesting a pass became a daily exercise in degradation. Conditions deteriorated. Electricity was rationed. Coal was scarce. Food became increasingly difficult to obtain. Overcrowding worsened as the already impoverished Chinese residents of Hongqiu, whose conditions were often as desperate, remained in place. The ghetto was not sealed the way European ghettos were. There was no wall, though barbed wire eventually appeared. Chinese and Jewish residents lived side by side, sharing the same miserable infrastructure, the same overflowing sewage, the same threat of disease. But the community held. The Mir Yeshiva, 400 rabbinical students and faculty who had fled from Poland to Lithuania, obtained transit visas from the Japanese consul Chiune Sugihara in Kaunas, traveled across the Soviet Union by train to Vladivostok, sailed to Kobe, and were finally relocated to Shanghai, continued studying throughout the war. They gathered in the Beth Aharon synagogue, built by one of the wealthiest Sephardic families, and used books reprinted from the handful of volumes they had carried across 3 continents. Through every twist of fate that had taken them from a small town in Poland to an overcrowded room in China, the Mir Yeshiva emerged as the only Eastern European yeshiva to survive the Holocaust intact. Today, it is one of the largest centers of rabbinical study in the world. Yiddish poets read their work in cramped apartments. Polish and Yiddish newspapers were published sporadically despite Japanese censorship. Plays were staged. Artists painted. A Zionist youth movement called Beitar recruited young members. Renee Maiman, who had been born in Vienna in 1927 and fled with her family after the Nazis confiscated their home, joined Beitar in Shanghai and enrolled at the Kaduri school. Her family opened Café Klinger, a Viennese restaurant in Little Vienna that thrived until the 1943 Ghetto Order. She would later recall living in constant fear of Japanese guards, of American bombs, of hunger, of the unknown. The American bombs were real. Shortly before the end of the war, a U.S. air raid targeting industrial facilities in Hongqiu killed approximately 40 Jewish refugees, including 7 Polish Jews and hundreds of Chinese civilians. The bombs did not distinguish between the persecuted and the occupied. Polish Jewish writers had a Yiddish expression for Shanghai, Schande Kai, a shame of a life. It meant survival that felt like an insult, not death, but not dignity either. The phrase captured something the statistics can't: the exhaustion of being alive only because a chaotic convergence of forgery, geopolitics, bureaucratic loopholes, individual courage, and strategic miscalculation happened to leave one door open when every other was locked. And then the war ended. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. The ghetto dissolved. The 20,000 refugees who had survived, almost all of them, faced a new question. Where now? Shanghai under the Chinese nationalists was unstable. Civil war between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong was escalating. Most refugees emigrated within the next few years to Palestine, to the United States, to Australia, to South America. By 1956, after the communist victory, virtually no Jews remained. But something lingered. In the courtyard of the former Ohel Moshe synagogue in Hongqiu, the building where Russian Jews had prayed since 1927 and where refugees had gathered during the war, the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum now stands. In 2014, a monument was unveiled bearing more than 13,000 names, 13,000 names of people who survived because they ended up in the one place on Earth that let them in without asking for a single piece of paper. In 2023, Jerry Lindenstrauss, 94 years old, living in New York, gave testimony about his childhood in the Shanghai Ghetto. His family had fled to Shanghai after Kristallnacht. He remembered living in half a room divided by a Persian carpet, without running water, with an outhouse on the roof. He remembered the fear, he remembered the hunger, and he remembered being alive. Lists of European concentration camp survivors were posted in Shanghai after the war. Refugees searched the names for relatives and friends. Successful reunions were, in the photographer Arthur Rothstein's documentation of the moment in April 1946, the rare exception. Most of the names they were looking for were not on any list. 20,000 people survived in Shanghai. 6 million did not survive in Europe. The difference was not heroism, though there were heroes. The difference was not justice. There was none. The difference was a sequence of absurdities that accidentally aligned. An open port with no passport control, a shipping line that ran luxury cruises from Genoa, a Chinese diplomat who signed papers against orders, a Japanese military that read a forgery and drew the wrong conclusion, and a Gestapo colonel whose plan for genocide was rejected not on moral grounds, but on strategic ones. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was written to prove that Jews secretly controlled the world and deserved to be destroyed. In Shanghai, the same document was read by Japanese officers who concluded that Jews secretly controlled the world and therefore should be kept alive. A lie designed to kill became, through a chain of misinterpretation and self-interest, a reason not to. 20,000 people lived because of a paradox built on a forgery, built on a plagiarism, built on a hatred that, in one improbable corner of the world, was misread as admiration. That is not a story about the triumph of good over evil. It is a story about the terrifying randomness of survival, and the fact that sometimes the only thing standing between 20,000 people and annihilation is a reading error in an antisemitic hoax, a diplomat's quiet disobedience, and a port that forgot to check for papers. The Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum still stands at 62 Changyang Road, in the building where the Ohel Moshe Synagogue once held services. The 13,000 names are still on the wall. The question they pose is not about the past. It is about every locked door, every denied visa, every conference where 31 out of 32 countries say not us. It is about who gets in, and what happens when nobody will open the door except a city that never thought to close it.